start the first session on the age of European exploration and discovery in an American history course. We're going to start off with two essential questions for this unit. First, what were the key European developments that made Columbus's voyage to America possible? And how did encounters between Native American peoples and Europeans affect each society? Now, essential questions are those questions that are open-ended. There is not one specific answer to these types of questions. So when we look at these questions in the future and questions like them, the idea is to explore and to come up with as many solutions to the problem as possible. Okay? So we're going to start off with the age of exploration, with the fall of Rome. So the Roman Empire, this giant monolithic empire that brought stability and peace to the ancient world, falls in the 400s, late 400s AD. And instead of having safety and security that the Roman legions and their roads, etc., brought, we fall into what scholars usually call the Dark Ages, in where you've got barbarian tribes like the Goths, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Huns, the Vikings, etc., who are roaming around during this period seeking riches but also destruction. And people really turn inward and seek safety over anything else. And a lot of trade, travel, art, literature, the things that come with safety and stability of a culture are really taken away. Individuals are giving up their freedom to the powerful in order to stay safe in an era of extreme danger. Okay? And then as we progress through the Middle Ages, or the medieval period, the Roman Catholic Church issues the call for a crusade, which is still highly controversial. But long story short, the Pope asked countries, knights, and nobility from all over the Western world to go to the area of modern day Israel, conquer Jerusalem, and set up a Christian empire there to strip it away from the Muslim people who lived there. And these expeditions are state-sponsored expeditions. So you've got countries and kings sometimes even participating themselves. People like King Richard the Lionhearted, from the popular film Robin Hood, or the children's film, are going to the Middle East to participate in this crusade. And what it does is it sets a precedent for state-sponsored excursions like this. And so when we see people like Da Gama and Magellan and Columbus, etc., later on in history, there's precedent for Marco Polo, there's precedent for these types of moves. All right? And what it also does is it opens the eyes of the Europeans to the golden age of Islam. Because while Europe is floundering in the Dark Ages and loses much of its art, literature, and culture, and science, and math, and everything else that comes with, stability and innovation in society, it is the Muslim world's golden age, where they are arguably at the peak as far as the world is concerned in all of the areas just mentioned. And so they come across inventions and math and all these things in the Muslim world, and also goods that are not available in Europe. And so these wealthy nobility, kings, etc., discover things that would be very, very valuable in trade, and they start seeking after trade routes to the Far East. Like I just said, this precedent paves the way for people like Marco Polo and Christopher Columbus. In 1271, you've got Marco Polo, who travels to China, and he gets there. He stays 17 years in China. He brings back, various things. He personally doesn't bring back the Black Death, but the trade route that gets opened up opens the Europeans up to not only trade and expensive goods, but also to diseases that are available are prevalent in different parts of the world. And this is going to be one of the common themes of this course. Whenever someone from one culture, region, geographical area goes to another area that they've never been to before, they risk exposure to diseases that are possibly deadly, not just to them, but their entire society when they go back home. Or if someone is coming to them, as in the case of, the Spanish, the Portuguese, Dutch, English going to the Americas, there's vast devastation of native populations as a result of disease. So Marco Polo goes to China. He comes back with these people who thought he was crazy, these stories of things like sewage systems where people are not throwing their chamber pots out into the middle of the streets and walking through it on a daily basis, but underground sewer systems and beautiful art and culture and literature, etc., that he found in the Far East. In a very, very advanced culture and society that he found in China, in addition to goods that could be traded back in Europe for a tremendous amount of money. So here we've got one of my favorite pictures of the fall of Rome, and I want to point out just a couple things in this painting. You've got a couple things here being depicted. You've got one of the barbarian tribes coming in, and I believe this is in the neoclassical style, where there's a lot of symbolism in the way that these types of paintings are painted, constructed, etc., using some advanced techniques like purposely orienting things in the picture in order to draw the eye to specific focal points, to draw attention to it, and therefore importance. And one of the first things that people notice is this woman on the bottom of the page, or on the bottom of the painting. She is fleeing a barbarian and possibly throwing herself into the sea. And one of the things that, females, especially if they're wearing white in this type of fashion, are portraying are things like innocence, purity, virtue, etc. And so you see the loss of all of those ideals with her fleeing and throwing herself into the sea rather than to be ravaged by this barbarian who is chasing after her. And then the second thing that a lot of people see, and this is fairly intentional, is this giant statue up in the corner and dominating the entire side of the painting. It's Rome's protector with the large shield that has lost its head, and it is no longer the defender of Rome. The legions are gone. Rome is falling. People are throwing themselves into the sea. There's chaos. Rome is burning. All the safety and security that the Roman Empire had brought is no more. Okay. And then you've got images like this from, I'm not exactly sure what this period is from, but a little bit more symbology here. You've got some kings who take up prominence in the picture, and typically the taller, like in medieval art, typically the taller the character is, the more important they are, and where your eye is naturally drawn is oftentimes the focal point for the most important things in the painting. So the first thing a lot of people see is this king, might be King Richard the Lionhearted, I'm not sure. I'm not exactly positive on who this figure is, but we've got this figure. If anyone knows, you can throw it in the comments below. That would be fantastic. We've got this king here who is, one of the crusaders from the Western world who is conquering the city. And you see this figure here, who I believe is Saladin, the Muslim general, who was one of the most widely respected figures during the crusade, the time of the Crusades. What's interesting about that is, despite him being the enemy, he's almost always portrayed as being honorable and noble and courteous, but at the same time being, tricky and decisive, etc., on the battlefield. Just an interesting thing that throughout history, even though this is a Western painting, that their enemy has been continuously praised for virtue. Okay. You've got Marco Polo, who came and went and ended up changing the Western world again, opening up the possibility for trade routes to the Far East with his tales that he brought back, even if some people thought he was lying about how great it was over there. Okay, in 1453, Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire end up falling to the Ottoman Turks. So what's really, really important to this is the former Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, was a Christian empire, which then falls to a Muslim empire. And so you've got now Muslims who are controlling essentially the gateway to the East. Geographically speaking, where the Ottoman Empire, it's located in and around the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, going down towards Africa and the Middle East, and going up towards Hungary, Austria-Hungary in the north, and it kind of wraps around, and it has key entry and access points to the old Silk Road and those types of things for traveling to the far east for trade. Western states, for obvious reasons, like they've been at war with Muslims, with the Crusades, etc., have had problems with Muslim peoples throughout the years. Specifically, Spain fights a war against the Moors, which are Muslim people in the south of Spain, for about 800 years prior to Columbus's expedition. And so you've got individuals like Ferdinand and Isabella, who are king and queen of Spain, who are looking for alternative routes to China. Western Europe lacks geographic proximity to China, and you've got huge barriers to overland travel, not just from the Muslim peoples, but also things like the Himalayas, the Gobi Desert, etc., that are huge barriers to safe and steady trade with this region. So they're looking for a possible other route to go through. Okay, and also you've got Italian city-states like Venice, who control trade through trade deals through the Ottomans, etc., control trade routes to and from the Far East. And so if you are not a Venetian, if you, say, come from England or Spain or Portugal or any of these other countries, cutting out one of the middlemen and being able to set up a trade route yourself would be much more lucrative to your country. Okay, so they're looking for alternative routes to China, but not just China, to India, to all the Far Eastern countries that have goods that are not available in Western Europe that are very, very expensive. So here we've got a picture depicting the Ottoman Empire. And as you see here, here's Europe, Western Europe here, and you've got the Eastern Roman Empire. At different time periods, they control different parts of this region, but they control the Dardanelles Strait, which is kind of the gateway to the east. But they also control the area around the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, And if you were at odds with the Ottoman Empire during this period and you want to trade in the Far East, it becomes very, very difficult. So finding an alternative route seemed like a really, really good idea. And let's talk about some things that helped these explorers actually be able to do that. One is advances in sailing and shipbuilding, but also in navigation technology. For instance, the Arab astrolabe. An astrolabe is an inclinometer that I'll try to explain it the best that I can. You hang it off of a ship, and it moves with the ship to always basically stay level. And then you use a line on it. It looks like this. You use this line as the horizon line. There's different plates that you put back here that match up with latitude and longitude lines. And then there are markers, I believe, on the inner and outer rings that correspond with stars, and so you can move these things around and figure out exactly where you are on the planet at that current time in relation to your map and the stars above. And it can also be used in the daytime to tell the time. I don't remember exactly how that works. But it is a very, very important tool for open ocean navigation when you don't have any land markers to go off of to find your way in the open sea. Okay, and then you've got people like the Vikings who are developing different ship hull construction, overlapping planks that are allowing ships to survive overseas, and they look like this. And so the importance of this is, if you have something completely static, picture one of these planks, but instead of being made of wood, they're made of glass. And the glass hits something hard, like a 50, 60 foot swell, or even, 20 foot wave, and it crashes down. Your boat could break in half. And the idea behind different hull constructions like this is it provides more flex and bend while still providing enough rigidity to sail through the open ocean steadily, but without shattering upon impact in larger swells. Here's an example of that in a museum. Okay. And then you've got larger ship designs being developed that can support holding more food and supplies and and people, etc., for longer voyages, and more improved stern rudders for better control in the open ocean, more accurate maps, and also the inquisitive impulse of the Italian Renaissance that ends up spreading throughout all of Europe, where people are once again, like in the Roman Empire, gaining enough safety, security, and wealth to be able to start thinking critically about the world and creating new inventions and thinking outside of just the very, very moment that they are living in. Okay, I'm going to skip that for now. Here's an example of a really, really cool old ship's map where you've got key stars that you can see in the sky, depending on where you are, and you've got points where you could use that astrolabe and figure out exactly where you are on the map. And this map has names of, I'm not sure if they're ports or tribes or exactly what they are, but it's not just lines on the map. They are annotating key areas on and around Africa and Europe and the Mediterranean Sea. Really, really cool map. So this is, you're using the stars to navigate at nighttime, and you're using specific angles and calculations to figure out exactly where you are at that current time. Okay. And again, larger ships are being built that can survive the open ocean seas. And then you've got nation building. So the Roman Empire falls, things are in chaos, and you've got strong individuals, warlords, to put a word to them, that are then becoming kings. And then those kings are expanding their influence and creating kingdoms through things like warfare and marriage and treaties, etc. And they're expanding their territory to the size that it is a full-blown nation. It's no longer just a small city-state. This king is ruling over, multiple cities, and they have enough wealth available and enough of a tax base in order to fund voyages of exploration and discovery. So ambitious monarchs like Ferdinand and Isabella, but also King George in later years, and King Louis XIII and 14th. These kings and queen and later on sometimes queens are developing or are sending people on these voyages to expand their empire, and it really gets kicked off by Columbus. Now, Columbus is not the first person to discover America, but as we'll discuss in a bit, he's one of the most important figures as far as like a turning point in history. So this is a representation of England, but you could put any figure in here from the period of European imperialism or the age of exploration. Spain would be the same, prior to England, where in this picture you see England, who's reaching out their tentacles to take over Egypt and India and Canada and Jamaica and Gibraltar and Malta, etc. Okay, and if you put Spain in here, it would be things like the Caribbean and it's hard without an image of a map in front of me. The Philippines, many countries in South and Central America, etc. Okay. Another thing that contributes to the age of exploration and the way that it developed was the Protestant Reformation. So Martin Luther is an important figure, Reformation figure. He was a monk and a scholar in Germany during the 1500s, who was given a position as a professor at Wittenberg, I believe it was Wittenberg College. Okay, and as he studies the Bible, he realizes some things about the Catholic Church that are not consistent with biblical teaching. And so he posts 95 theses in Latin on the door of Wittenberg Church. And this was a thing that was typically done at the time. The church doors were kind of a message board, if you will, for the time period. They didn't have internet or anything like that. So the church doors became a place where you could post things. Now, it's interesting to note and important to note that he does post it in Latin, which is not something that the common person could read and write in at that time. It was the language of scholars and specifically of the church. And so what this means is he was writing this as a series of scholarly questions to possibly bring about scholarly theological discussion within the church. Well, what happened is someone got a hold of it, translated it into German, used a printing press, and then sent it everywhere. And so, long story short, the Catholic Church excommunicates Luther. A number of powerful, princes and kings, but as well as many individuals decide to break away from the Catholic Church, and it shatters the Christian world into hundreds of different denominations eventually. Okay, and you've got nations like England, who under King Henry VIII doesn't want to. He wants a divorce. Catholic Church won't give it to him, and he decides to just break away completely from the Catholic Church. So you've got whole nations who are not conforming to the edicts under the Catholic Church. And so when treaties are signed, as we'll see in a minute, under the authority of the Pope, these nations don't recognize this, and so it spurs on more competition for territory and colonization, and sparks wars between, England and France and Spain amongst others. Okay. So England competes for land with Spain, not merely for economic and political reasons, but also religious implications, because they are not Roman Catholic anymore. Okay, you've got Martin Luther King. I believe this is one of the German princes who is protecting him, and he is defending his faith. I believe this was from one of the famous debates he has. Okay, so Columbus. And getting back on track here. So Columbus, considered the admiral of the Ocean Sea, native of Genoa, Italy. He goes to Portugal. He asks the king there if he will fund an expedition to the not the New World, but across the Atlantic to China, India, etc., to the Far East. Now, it's a really big misnomer. I don't know how this rumor got started, but Columbus didn't set out to prove that the world was round. It was a common belief amongst scholars at the time and learned people that the earth was round. Problem is, you needed technological advances to safely cross the Atlantic Ocean. And so Columbus comes in at a time when, one, the technology is available, and two, the information that the world is round is available, and three, he comes with an entrepreneurial spirit. I mean, he's resilient, he's courageous, he's confident. He also does horrible things. But you cannot... I would like to caution you, whoever's watching this, to just paint people as good and evil in entirety, because that's not really the way that the world works. Okay? Did Columbus have qualities that we admire in an ambitious entrepreneur who's like starting their own business or their own venture, etc.? Yes, absolutely. He was courageous. He was, suave enough to convince a king and a queen to support his expedition, etc. But he also was completely morally bankrupt in his actions in the New World. So it's a cautionary tale. All right. So the King of Portugal refuses to fund him. King Ferdinand, Queen Isabella, after defeating the Moors and telling the Muslims who in Spain they can either die or leave or convert. Those were really the only three options for people. After that war is done, there's a little bit more peace and stability. They end up funding Columbus in his trip to China. He doesn't get to China, but that's the plan anyways, okay? He's sent with 3 ships. And the reason why this is important is because when we think of 3, wooden ships, it's not really that big of a deal to us. We have modern building techniques, etc., tools, things like that. But naval vessels at this point in history are some of the most advanced, expensive things you could possibly send out. It would be like asking a country like the United States of America to borrow, or Russia or something like that, to borrow a space shuttle. Could it possibly be done? Could you possibly convince a government to do it, to go explore something? Sure. But it would take some real convincing. And so they're giving up national assets in short supply that are very, very expensive to send him. And that's why it takes him some convincing to actually make this happen. Now, Columbus ends up landing in the Bahamas, the island, the island he's famous for, colonizing is Hispaniola, or, Cuba and the Dominican Republic today. Bahamas and Cuba, October 12, 1492. And he does maintain discipline, encourage hope during his 10-week journey. He's constantly, trying to motivate his sailors to get there, and he says that he hopes to convert the natives that he finds in this new place to our holy faith by love, not force. He did not do this. And I really want to point out to whoever's watching this that it is really, really important that you know that as a leader, people take what you say and it will encourage people and bring them hope. It could also bring them down depending on what you're saying. But what Columbus is remembered for throughout history is really two main things. One, the discovery for the majority of the Western world of a bountiful land. Now, Leif Erikson, Viking, discovered Canada. He discovered North America. There's a really good possibility that they were Chinese sailors that also discovered the Americas at one point in time. There's also a good chance that African sailors that at one point in time had discovered America. But their discovery didn't get printed on a printing press, spread all over the Western world, and spread the entire era of exploration. Okay, so this is what Columbus is known for, primarily. But the other thing Columbus is known for is his absolutely horrific treatment of human beings and his horrible greed when he's in the New World. I mean, he did things like, upon discovering that that he was not in fact in India, he was not in fact in India. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but and he finds gold. He forces the native population to deliver gold to him on a regular basis, or he would, chop off people's arms and legs and limbs in punishment for not bringing the quota that he wanted. Just absolutely horrible things that he did. Okay, and that's just one small example. Okay, so Columbus discovered a world, like we mentioned earlier. There's people who had gotten there before, a world that had been inhabited for 12,000, 40,000 scholars. Some people say 8,000. There's a lot of debate on the date range. Let's suffice it to say that there were people in the Americas for a long time before Columbus got there. Okay, for thousands of years. So by 1500, 15 to 75 million Native Americans speaking 30 languages occupied the continent. And there's some recent scholarship in the last 10 to 15 years that is really pushing this number, 75 million, possibly more. This I really should just delete. There were not 15 million Native American people speaking 30 languages. There were 75 million plus, at least, between North, South, and Central America. There's solid archaeological evidence that there was, just in what today is in the United States and Canada, there were upwards of 20 million Native American peoples living in that region prior to disease and other things that wipe people out. You've got Columbus here, legendary figure in history. For better or for worse, we are still talking about it. Okay, so new conclusion he comes to after being there for a while is that he's stumbling across a new landmass. It's fertile to a limitless degree, and he blazes a trail, allowing other explorers to easily secure funding for future voyages, because he brings back things like gold and new flora and fauna, plants and animals, back to back to Europe that had never been seen before, and so they realized they've discovered on a literal, gold mine, but a figurative one also, with new goods that could be traded in Europe. Okay, so Columbus's voyage for Spain marks the most important economic intersection of people and places in human history, and it is. Okay, it completely changes the world. I'll just stop here briefly. We've got a number of large expeditions happening. This is just 3 of them. You've got Columbus in 1492, Magellan is killed. Magellan's crew goes on, Vasco da Gama, traveling around the Horn of Africa. They're eventually getting to India to trade there, etc. And the world is becoming a smaller place. In other words, it's still very large. However, travel all over the globe via ship is now becoming a reality. Okay, so the impacts of the Age of Exploration. You've got the Treaty of Tordesillas, or Tordesillas. I don't know exactly how to pronounce that, between Spain and Portugal. Now, when I mentioned the Pope earlier, this is what I was talking about. So the line of demarcation, it shaves off a portion of what is modern day Brazil from the Americas, and the Popes and the Spanish and Portuguese all agree that belongs to the Portuguese, and so the Portuguese ended up settling in Brazil. That's why they still speak Portuguese there today. And essentially the rest is Spain's. Now, the Dutch, the English, the French, they don't accept this. Also, Portugal is given Africa to take over as well. And so Portugal is solidified early on as a major slave supplier to the Bahamas, the East Indies, etc., to Spain, who is then ends up setting up, the farm plantation there, and the exploitation of people is off and running. It's just absolute. The things that were done during these people are just so absolutely horrifying to the modern reader and studier of history. It's really terrifying. It's no wonder why children are taught a glorified version of things like Christopher Columbus's discovery, and a lot of the horrors are left out because it's not developmentally appropriate for children to really study American history or the history of the Americas, because there's so much terror that went on. One of those things is this concept of living bravely. Okay, so these conquistadors, these entrepreneurs, explorers, people who are starting new colonies, people who own the encomiendas, etc. They are praised as heroes for quote-unquote living bravely. And under this concept of living bravely, rules are suspended for the treatment of anyone else outside of Europeans while you're in this new world. Okay, the reason I put the new world thing in quotes is because it's not a new world. It's been there for a long time, but that's what they called it. All right, so the rules are suspended. Explorers and settlers are living bravely or without restraint, and what this leads to, it's like there are no rules, so it leads to unbridled greed, enormous accumulation of wealth, organized thievery, brutality, heartless slaughter, and the exploitation of the native peoples who lived there before. That's what this was. So you hear and this whole concept is just propaganda in and of itself. You're telling people to go live bravely and that sounds like a good thing. Okay, we all want to live. Living bravely sounds fantastic, but the concept and real idea here behind this ideology is very sinister at the core, because it's based on the idea that you are somehow better than another person, and they are there to be exploited for your benefit. Just horrifying. Okay, and then Spain's rise from late 1400s, 1492, in these expeditions. Peaks in 1588 when they decide to go take over England. They send out the Spanish Armada, 130 ships, 30,000 plus soldiers, and the British scramble. They're terrified. They round up a bunch of pirates and say, hey, we'll forgive all of your sins. And the pirate ships, along with the Royal Navy, end up defeating the Spanish Armadas. It's one of the largest upsets in all of human history. And then these pirates are knighted and ennobled and sent back out to continue to harry the enemies of the English crown. And it marks the peak of the Spanish Empire, and then the start of a new era where you've got England, France, the Dutch, etc., who are competing at the top level for world domination, control, colonies, etc. This is a similar map to earlier with some of these explorations, but this also has early Spanish claims along South America and Mexico and the Bahamas, obviously Spain, but then you've got Portuguese claims in the Philippines. You've got Spanish claims in the Philippines. The Portuguese are here in Brazil and places in Africa in the Middle East and India. They're setting up global trade routes to make and colonies to make their nations more profitable. Okay, and I'm going to just pause on this image for a sec, because this is what living bravely looked like. So Columbus, who was get off that. Columbus, who found gold, had to bring something back to Ferdinand and Isabella to justify what he did. So he found gold, and he got greedy, and he forced people to bring him gold, or he literally was chopping limbs off to punish people and make an example of them. And it was just absolutely horrifying. Between disease and the brutality of the Spanish, within 100 years, almost all the native population of the island of Hispaniola was completely wiped out. It was just absolutely terrible things that were done to these people. Okay, you've got the Spanish Armada here, the Spanish versus the English, and it's this giant sea of ships everywhere. This huge naval battle that ends up in England's favor. Okay, zooming forward in time, then you've got things like the 7 Years' War, where the French and English have their colonial rivalries in North America, England, or India, and around the world, as a result of the attempted control. Ends up with France losing a lot of its overseas territory, and the 7 Years' War, which is also called the French and Indian War, ends up with England controlling Canada. And then, this is a unit for further in the future, but events after the 7 Years' War and some decisions of Parliament end up leading to the American Revolution. Okay? Impact of the Age of Exploration is a global network. The world is now unified in a way that it has never been before. Not peacefully, but unified in that there is now trade and interaction going on in the major continents of Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. It's not the whole world, but you've got more cross-cultural experiences going on than have really ever happened before. across this type of expanse. All right, and you've got international trade starting up. You've got the first examples of international conglomerates and publicly traded companies, via stocks that rise up during this era. You've got a redistribution of wealth with these entrepreneurs who are often not part of the old order of the nobility, who are now becoming extraordinarily wealthy, which brings power in and of itself. And things are starting to change in Europe and in these places where people start thinking, well, why am I not better than this other person? I can do all of these things. People start thinking critically about society, applying the scientific method. Again, we'll talk about that in a later unit. And you've got the diffusion of European values and religion onto different continents all over the world, where Europeans are going in and forcing their culture, values, religion, for better or for worse, onto the native populations for whatever that region was. And I'm not just talking about the Americas. We're talking Africa and East Asia, India, the South Pacific, etc. Okay? And then you've got the triangular slave trade, which is bringing, new goods and animals, crops, etc., to both the Americas and to Africa and to Europe. Things like corn and chili peppers never existed before in Europe, and things like pigs, horses, and wheat didn't exist before in the Americas. And so you've got these new plants and animals who are being traded and transported between these three continents, which is vastly changing the way people live, the way people eat and do things. But it also creates this triangular slave trade and the African diaspora, the scattering of African peoples all over the world as slaves, specifically in the Americas, to work as slaves. I mean, these people are captured and taken from their homes and sent to, in a lot of cases, work until they die, especially in sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean. Just horrible working conditions. And you definitely see how the traditions and stories that these slaves and then former slaves are telling their children, etc. And conversely, you've got slave owners and slave masters are telling their children. That creates a cycle of distrust and anger and hate and racial tension that you see throughout the world, and especially in America today. And I think one of the things that we need to do to combat this kind of stuff is to have an open dialogue about how terrible these things were, to recognize it, and to start seeing the humanity in someone else, despite the level of melanin in their skin or the culture in which they come from, etc. Okay? And then you've got the redistribution of the world's population. Voluntary and involuntary, there were people moving around the globe and exchanging culture and food, etc., like it never happened before. And this is called the Columbian Exchange, when you've got new plants and animals and things like that that are traveling in this triangle between Africa, Europe, the Americas, back and forth in between. Okay, and then one of the other large impacts, just absolutely horrifying, is the ravages of disease on Native American populations all over North, South, and Central America. They're completely unprepared, and they've never been exposed to some of the horrible European diseases like smallpox and many others, and cholera and all these other ones. And I mean, it's estimated that well over 90% of the Native American populations in the Americas were killed by sweeping epidemics of disease. Millions and millions of people. And so it's no wonder when these Europeans are then trying to conquer and take over regions why the Native Americans are not prepared to fight against the Europeans. If you've lost 90% of your population to disease, you're probably not in a position to really to fight. I mean, you've lost 90% of your strength. I mean, this is kind of the stuff that we're talking about. Again, we'll get to that stuff at later times. And the irony and unintended consequence of all this is Columbus would be surprised by the controversy we talk about him today. Okay, the irony is that the consequences are wholly unlike the intentions of the people who planned the events. His theme is going to be repeated over and over again. So Columbus, he thinks he's living bravely and doing heroic work, and he's bringing people to Jesus. I mean, it's like convert or be killed, but I mean, in his mind, in his writings, he is doing the Lord's work, and he is a great guy. He is the hero of his own story. And through the modern reader's eyes, we're just horrified by his actions and others like him. And I just think it's ironic that the values that he held were so different than the values today. Okay, here you've got that triangular trade, the Columbian Exchange, where you've got things like oil, lumber, furs, rice, silk, indigo, dye, tobacco, sugar, molasses, wood, going over to England. This is just some of the examples. You've got slaves who are being captured and taken from their home, but also gold, ivory, spices, hardwoods that are going there. You've got slaves that are being transported up here, sugar, molasses, etc. Manufactured goods, luxuries, guns, but it also doesn't mention you've got things like pigs and horses and chickens and stuff like that, and wheat and barley that never existed in the Americas before. And you've got corn and chilies and all sorts of indigenous plants and spices that are coming from this region of the world that are going over to these places that never existed there either. So these are not exhaustive lists, is what I'm trying to say. They're just giving you some examples of the things that were traded. Okay, like here, here's some of the flora and fauna. You can pause and read that for yourself if you'd like. But there's a lot of things that just didn't exist over here, that then flourished in other regions. And we're going to stop there for today. Thank you for joining me and sticking around for the end of the video. Have a fantastic day.